Okay, you all good? Let's do it. Hello and welcome to the B2C Lead Generation Podcast.
Today's episode is entitled Why Data Transparency and Consent Unlocks Growth. Now, if you listened to the show before, we talk about transparency a lot, but this is the first time we're really going to focus on transparency as the main subject of the pod, and that's exciting. And to help us do that, we've got J Cromack. Welcome to the show, Jay.
Hi, good to see you guys.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. So just to kind of kick things off, like as part of the research into this, I kind of look around the website and look around the company and sort of see what jumps out to get me, what jumps out at me and what sort of interests me. And I saw something, I don't know where, but I've written down that said, my Latitude's vision is to live in a world where your data powers positive outcomes for you and your society as a whole. I thought that was really cool. It's got a kind of a Simon Sinek, why you're doing it sort of vibe to it, which is really interesting. But just to kind of focus in on that, could you explain a little bit more about what that means to people listening?
Yeah, sure. I think if I give a little bit of a backstory, if that's all right, without wanting to bore you guys, but kind of it's really how My Life Digital came about. I like to say that I've been a data practitioner for a number of years, and up until probably 2014, I was like many other people, quite happily using data that belonged to customers, to do the right thing, never anything unethical, but never really considering the potential consequences on the individual when using that data. I actually read a book called The Circle, which I would suggest you don't watch the movie on Netflix because it's not very good.
I've read the book actually as well. Who is it? Is it
Dave Eggers?
Dave Eggers, that's it. Yeah, I've read the book. Yeah.
And I read that book, and I've been traveling a lot to America because we sold a business to an American firm. We were doing lots of kind of deep data analytics and, millions and millions of customer records. And we were always trying to get this kind of 360-degree view of the customer, try and really understand what they were up and what made them tick. And it was when I read that book, and they were trying to get not just a 360-degree view, but a 365-day, 24/7 view of the individual. And a lot of people started to go off grid and kind of like opting out of the platforms and opting out of kind of a digital society. And it was really as I read that book, I was thinking, well, what if that was to happen in reality? And this is the kind of thing I'm doing. I'm doing all of this stuff, and I'm never really looking at the potential weaponization of data and what might come of it. And it was when I was doing that, I had a conversation, left that company, and really My Life Digital came about. And what we were trying to do is think, well, if people don't trust organizations with their data, then actually society will lose out as a whole, and they will lose out as well, because actually a lot of good can come from sharing of data, but also a lot of bad and a lot of harm can come as well. And that's really, so we went about, how do you do that? And right at the start, we were thinking, well, we really want to be an organization where it's very people-centric, where an individual is in full control of their data. And, an individual can have their data in their own strongbox, as we called it, or what we were looking at, and then they can permission that data to be used across many different organizations, health authorities, government, etc. But they were in control. Obviously, that's a bit of an altruistic view, and it's a very difficult business to scale. And like people at the company hear me say it a lot, and I hope I don't mind me swearing, but I call it the gas moment. When people start to give a shit about their data, because at that time I don't think people really cared enough. But obviously, since then, we've seen the Cambridge Analytica. We've seen there's been a lot of documentaries on Netflix like The Great Hack. And so on, and looking at that. And people are starting to become aware that their data has value and that organizations are desperate to get hold of it, and that a lot of organizations are getting hold of it, but then they're using it for purposes that they might not necessarily know. So really our focus when we set the business up was, how do you permission that data effectively? And that's really kind of how we ended up very much in the kind of the consent and preference management world, but working with organizations to become way more transparent with consumers over the data they need and the purposes they need it for, and to empower consumers to actually make decisions over how it can and can't be used. And that's really where it came about. And I just really, because I need to touch on the fact that it's not My Life Digital anymore, because we've just recently sold the company to an organization called DataGuard, who are a German-based privacy as a service organization. And reason why we've done that is they've got a very similar vision to us, which I really loved, and I was kind of jealous that we didn't come up with it, which is to protect the people behind the data. So actually we've kind of joined together and hopefully we're going to do great things going forwards. But sorry, a bit of a backstory, I probably waffled on, but that tells you where we've come from.
It's really interesting, actually. I think when we spoke before, so Jay and I first had a chat, I don't know, time loses all meaning under COVID, but it was probably 6 months ago now. But a bit of your backstory is I went through a very similar thing, actually. And I think that we spoke about it where we were involved in, or I was in the commercialization of data and basically earning huge amounts of revenue from it. And around a similar time came up with the same sort of ideas, which was, how do we put the power back into people's hands so that they control their data rather than it sort of just being let loose into the wild? And there's new stuff coming out now because there's a sort of zeitgeist about it now with iOS 14 and the sort of the arguments between Facebook and Apple. And so you've got stuff like Generate Ads, this guy that was on Dragon's Den that's doing trying to empower people's data. It's a strange thing, isn't it? Where I think that people that were involved in data early on probably, or some people recognized this issue, but it was too early to potentially do anything about it. And now it's becoming like much more to the fore, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say when we set out, 2014, 2015, it really wasn't the thing, and people didn't really think about it. But actually, there was a white paper released by the World Economic Forum around about the same time, which was, looking at data through a new lens, effectively personal data, and it was really trying to kind of speak to kind of the three core pillars around kind of how organizations must be looking at personal data going forwards, which is, transparency was the big one, empowerment was the second one, and third one was accountability. And actually, if you look at those three things, those have all been kind of picked up very much within, dare I say it, almost 3 years on GDPR as the key area that, you've got to be complete transparent. You've got to inform the individual. And I think GDPR has obviously helped because organizations are starting to, really understand that it is more than just tick boxes when it comes to getting consent and so on, because people really need to understand. But I think, the regulation, people are starting to learn more about it because, what you're seeing with Apple, they are using privacy as a differentiator. You're starting to see lots of organizations recognize that privacy, needs to be a bit like, I think Gartner said, it's a bit like the new fair trade coffee. You're going to buy a product based on how they look after your privacy and how they treat your privacy. And I think that's really important because, people are beginning to understand, and they are understanding that data has, as I said, a value, and it can be used for good and it can be used for harm. And they want to make sure that they're working with reputable organizations. And I think, later we're going to be kind of looking at some of those kind of deeper areas around, how organizations just get consent and then, assume therefore they can do anything they like with data. But that's kind of where we get into the kind of the ethical side around, you might have the legal right to do something with someone's data, but the question mark is should you be doing it? And I think it's a real fine balance at the moment for organizations to get it right when they're thinking about personal data and going forwards.
And something that you said there, you talk about helping individuals and companies understand the sort of meaning, the value of data, but what does that, in actionable terms, what does that require them to start doing?
So, I mean, I'll give you a good example. Just pre-GDPR, we all got bombarded with these emails, didn't we, saying, please consent into this. And it was an absolute nightmare. But there was a reason for that, because there was a lot of this implied consent going on pre-GDPR, and obviously when everything came into force, what it meant was that your consent that you had around using data had to be of quite a high grade. You needed to be able to determine where you collected the consent, what information you provided to the data subject, time stamping it, how long you're going to rely on it, all of those things. And a lot of organizations didn't have that. So when we talk about the kind of like the meaning and the value of data, we were speaking to one prospect who on the 24th of May 2018 had the ability of contacting via email 1.8 million customers and or prospects, and then on the 25th of May they could only contact 18,000 because they suddenly had to shut it down because they didn't collect those consents. And so there was one area around, it was more around the trusted data, the meaning and the value of trusted data, because if it's all very well an individual trusting you, but also if you're a marketeer and you can't trust your data, and if you're you've got to look at the governance, you can't trust the data because you don't know where you got it from, you don't know why don't know why you collected it in the first place, you couldn't define a purpose around it, you haven't got you don't know the provenance of the data, you suddenly lose all of that meaning and you lose all of that value around the data. And a lot of organizations found themselves in that position where, I don't know, I've got 3.5 million records on my database. Okay, maybe 1.5 million of them are active customers. I've got no idea sometimes where the rest of the data came from. And obviously that meant they had to go. So that was one area, but also what we found with the regulation was organizations did really have to start understanding what data they did hold on people, what purposes they were using it for. And then once they did that, they could see where they had the right permissions in place to use the data. And once they had that mapped out and understood what they could and couldn't do with data, then they could start to put in place strategies, if you like, to capture the right consents so that they had the right kind of permissions, consents in place to actually kind of grow their data, grow their revenues and so on. And that's really what we mean by that.
Yeah, I remember many years ago when the quantity of data that you held was the sort of determinant of success of the company. So everyone who was a marketeer and used to work in direct marketing used to say they've got 65 million records. And in reality, it was the same 65 million records that everybody held in lots of different companies. And what they do is just buy it off each other in order to send the same messages or different marketing or whatever to other companies. And that continued sort of right up until GDPR. And as you mentioned, the quantity suddenly became less important, and it was more about the consent and also the quality and things. But we still see the same thing in lead generation, where people chase the quantity of leads that they can get, and the consent, what they're looking for isn't necessarily consent as in the person knows that they're going to be contacting. It's like a loophole they're looking for, which is they've got consent, but they might not know that I'm the one contacting them. And I think that's still potentially an issue for me anyway. That's, I know you and I talked previously about a website that we were looking at where they've got sort of opt-ins on for different third parties on the website. And so via that, you can still collect a lot of information on people, which is legal, but how much sort of intent and consent does that actual person have?
Yeah, I think, we were looking at that site, and I know there's going to be no names, but, that kind of drove me to go back and just do a bit of a refresh around, just to relook at Article 4, which is the definition of consent, and then Article 7, which is the conditions of consent. And, again, without getting too geeky, it's all about, for me, just in simple terms, it's got to be really clear and specific, and the individual needs to know what they're consenting to, and to have a list of companies hidden behind a kind of a click box, which are hundreds and hundreds, and then to kind of assume that is informed consent, I think will be a challenge for a lot of organisations. And I'm also, having come at it from a background of a marketeer, I'm also a pragmatist, and I know that organisations need to exist and they need to be commercial. They need to capture leads, but actually, is a lead that valuable to an organisation when individuals come onto a website and the next thing you know, that lead's now being farmed out for 100 different purposes to 200 different companies? Is there any value in that at all? I wouldn't say so, and I think that's what GDPR's done. It's kind of led to kind of adding a lot better quality around data, because people are, because if organisations are being transparent with them and saying, look, I need your data for this purpose, are you okay with that? Then an individual will either say yes or no. And if they say yes, then you're onto something, and you can then start to nurture it or try and sell something and so on. If they say no, the chances are it's probably because they're not interested. And I think that's that's what I think the transparent piece is really good. And if organisations start to move in that direction, and don't be afraid, I always say the thing that to a lot of my clients, if you can't describe why you need someone's data over the table to your grandmother without it sounding creepy, then it probably is creepy, and therefore you probably shouldn't be doing it. So it's kind of those things. And certainly I'd say that website you showed me something was certainly on the creepy side. It was kind of like, there was a lot going on in the background that wasn't necessarily, you felt you were being really informed at the front, but there was a lot going on behind the scenes which wasn't quite as informed.
I think that's still potentially rife in certain markets as well, and a lot of companies rely on that data that sort of spew out of those websites, purely because they're taking a spray and pray approach to their marketing, and they believe that that consent is a sort of loophole that gives them this ability to contact people, and it's regardless of the transparency. They're just trying to hammer them to get sales. Is what it's usually based on. So the one that we were looking at that we highlighted was a loan site. So what the companies that are then listed will then try and do is they're thinking this is the type of individual who might need these sort of services. But the problem for me is even if we took the position it was legal, right? So what they were doing was allowed, which is very, very questionable anyway. But there's no transparency and there's no intent behind the user. So we talk about this thing with like consent and intent. So consent sort of, is one thing, but there needs to be an element of intent. And the only way you can get that intent is, like you said, to actually be transparent. Because if you're transparent, they know what's going to happen, and so they can easily opt out of it anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's why that's why we talk about transparency drives the value, because you're getting a much better quality data product coming off the back of it. And I think as saying that site, whilst they may believe it's legal, the accountability of buying that data actually falls on the organization that's buying it as well. If they're buying that data, it falls on them to validate that the consent that has been received by the third party they're receiving the data from is actually a valid consent. And I think that would be a challenge, for that organization to be able to demonstrate the validity of that consent. And that's where a lot of organizations, I know where you guys, because I've seen your product as well, you have great kind of provenance and kind of receipting, if you like, around the consent that you receive around the leads that you're generating, so that when you do pass it on to a third party or a client, they know that you've got a proper valid consent on their behalf. And I think that's the importance. So many companies have, I think, kind of delivered what I would call the minimum viable product around consent, and not really understood what consent is, because they haven't really taken a human-centric approach. They've taken kind of what I think you guys were referring to, the sales-centric approach. Just give me as much bloody data as I can get, and I'm just gonna bombard the crap out of these people until I get what I want. Whereas the informed consent delivers better value to any organization. I think people just got to start thinking about putting more value around that first party data.
Yeah,
I think I just want to kind of focus on that a little bit there, Jay, because people listening to this, we talk about transparency and consent in this idealistic way a lot of the time. I know myself and Simon do, and that's great, it's what we believe. But some people listening, like we said in the kind of the title of this podcast, is it's actually good for them as a business as well as for the consumer. And we sort of say transparency and consent unlocks growth, and we talked there about the previous sort of sales-centric approach. But what kind of, just to reinforce that, what are the sort of limitations of doing it the old way, and how is this new way a kind of a way to unlock growth for companies?
I mean, I think there are challenges, right, to capturing transparent consent, because and capturing consent in a ethical and also in a compliant manner. So I'm going to kind of talk about something that that's out there called the consent paradox, and the consent paradox is actually kind of almost, whilst I'm out preaching transparency, consent, the consent paradox almost kind of turns people off against transparency and privacy and so on. Because if you get hit with a consent wall with 50 flipping options to hit before you can progress to the next step, as an individual, I'm gonna be hunting out that accept all button because I just want to get on to the next point. And that's a real problem, because that kind of then means organizations are still getting consent that is probably still is unlawful. Well, definitely unlawful if they've used an accept all button, but gives you the I guess from their point of view, they've delivered what they wanted to because they wanted to get onto the UX, but the individual hasn't really understood the point around the privacy. So there are real challenges to doing things compliantly in a way that gives an organization the ability to deliver the personalization and the value and the kind of that kind of bespoke solution to a customer when they come onto their website. So I know there's a lot of challenges. So practical ways around that, where we come it from is I call it with our clients kind of to be practical is the data game is a bit like the dating game. You don't jump in on day one and ask for everything about an individual, because that would just again come across being a bit weird and a bit creepy. But if you were to kind of get a few key pieces of information and permissions, if we relate it to consent, and obviously you need to be careful when you talk about dating games and consent and so on, but you know what I mean. The next time that person visits your website, if you have an automated system where you know what permissions and what consents you have in place, then don't ask for them again. So the next time they come, ask for the next most valuable consents to enable you to kind of like extend that relationship a bit further and keep on going. And I think that for us is kind of enables an organization to deliver then that transparency piece, because I can now actually say, I need this consent for this purpose, I need this consent for this purpose, and an individual can actually read it and engage with you and understand why you need it. And right back in 2012, when we were looking at research around investing and building out My Life Digital, we found a research study into an organization that had done some A/B testing on web forms on major brands. And what they'd actually done is they'd taken kind of these forms where many of the components of the form have been mandatory. And then they A/B test them by taking that same form and making many of those elements optional, and then actually putting a forget me button above it. And the form that had the forget me button and was predominantly optional actually collected 18% more data than the form that was predominantly mandatory. So it just goes to show that an individual, if they feel more in control and they feel as though there's more trust there through that forget me button, they were actually more prepared to give data up. And I think that's important when you look at that transparency piece. If you are open with an individual, they're going to trust you more. And if they trust you more, they're going to give you more information. And I think they're the practical areas. And as I say, to practically deliver it, if you're a marketer, you know, you're thinking, crikey, I'm going to have to present a consent wall to my customers, which is going to turn them off from the user experience to do it right. Well, don't do it in that way. Do it just in time. Do it contextually. Ask for those permissions as and when you need them, not on day one, because you might need them. And I think that's kind of a big difference. And that's kind of how our approach comes at it when we look at that consent paradox.
I think that's a brilliant idea, and that would apply to like the metadata. So it could be used for retargeting as well as any sort of personal data. So it could be, you know, you'd suddenly pop up like a Taboola opt-in and say, yeah, because you're not currently a customer, if they were just a prospect, we'd like to be able to retarget you with products or services that we think that you might like. I think one of the things it comes back to as well is this sort of, in a particular sphere of lead generation and direct marketing, is the very transactional approach that everyone takes to it. So it's completely driven, as you mentioned, by like getting a sale, getting someone's data, so that there's just like a one-hit wonder that can happen. So, you know, they're not going after the long-term like relationship or value. But one of the things that we always talk about is actually lead generators, because by their nature, they're then very transactional, because they're just trying to collect someone's data and pass it on to a client or whatever. If they actually started to look at becoming more like a brand themselves and building relationships with the prospects that they generate, that consent mechanism is the route that you would follow, because then that gives you the ability to like engage the person as a lead for a particular product in the first place, and then keep this relationship going whilst being like overly transparent, and also build your product and your offering out at the same time. And I mean, I think that's the future that, you know, they need to follow, because I think there's, you know, personal data is just like you said, it's people are becoming more aware of it, and where it gets abused is just going to slowly die, I would think.
Yeah, and I think also, you know, the regulators, you know, are now starting to enforce around doing it right. And, you know, again, you know, I'm not going to mention any names, but we had a client that, you know, wasn't doing anything knowingly wrong. You know, they had a consented marketing base. They were communicating with their customers, but they were also communicating with those customers along the lines of third-party products. And what they hadn't appreciated under, you know, more aligned to PECA regulations was that if you want to market third-party products to your customers, you need a separate consent to market third-party products to them. And that was a real challenge, because suddenly I've got to introduce a new purpose. And, you know, I think for this particular client, for them to do that, one, that would have been a huge amount of time on their websites and their IT and infrastructure. So we, you know, because we've come at it as, you know, that kind of progressive, introducing new purposes over time, what they're able to do was actually introduce a new purpose, a new consent box in that journey with their customer at a particular point in time, and say, hey, we'd like to be able to send you some great offers from third parties that we have relationships with. Would you be okay with that? And it's a simple yes and no. So you're asking that along the journey, and you're capturing a compliant consent, and then you can start promoting those products. Whereas, you know, a lot of, as you say, a lot of companies just view it as a single consent. I've got an opt-in to do email. It's great, but actually it's not granular. It doesn't really mean anything, because the customers, you know, not necessarily kind of opted into that. They've just opted into an email from you, but not about certain things. So again, that's around adding more value to the customer around it.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. And just to bring it back to Netflix, like I think as we started on with, have you seen it's a show that's called Maniac or something like that, where like on a really sort of granular level, like people can opt in for like adverts, and like on like an individual thing, they can give data for like individual ones. And have you seen that before?
I haven't seen that. I'm going to have to look that one up. But yeah,
so I think they're in like shops, and they'd be like, "Do you agree to an advert?" And they'd be like, "Yeah," and then they just like instantly get one. It's quite interesting maybe to think about. Yeah. Just to sort of bring it back around then, because I think we have sort of answered this and we've covered a lot of the kind of topics about just sort of summarize it. So the subject of this podcast, the title is Why Data Transparency and Growth and Consent Unlocks Growth. Can you sort of summarize why you think transparency and consent is key to this for companies moving forwards?
Yeah, I think I actually print something out because I'm my memory is rubbish. So I just thought, if I've got it here, have I got it here? I'm pretty sure I have. That's a problem.
Let's hope you don't forget some of the GDPR rules, eh?
I've got, because it's a really great comment, and this guy, he's one of the lawyers from Unilever, and he's kind of attached the kind of the marketing division there, and Unilever are doing amazing things around delivering kind of data ethic frameworks around how they're using data, and they've established he's, if you like, chair of the World Federation of Advertisers, have a data ethics committee now, and they're really pushing down on the whole sector, the importance of doing data transparently and doing it right and putting ethics in. And this was something that a quote from that report, that Jane Wakely, she's the lead CMO at Mars, so quite important lady when it comes to marketing. And for me, it kind of just showed how seriously brands are now starting to consider data ethics, and they're looking at it from a human-centric approach. And she basically said, any conversation around data needs to be human-centric. And for advertisers and marketeers, it must have consumers at the heart. How we use data in the next few years will undoubtedly shape our future, and this power must be harnessed responsibly and legally. As a purpose-driven company whose 5 principles have guided our decisions for over a century, we know these values must apply to every facet of our business. That includes using data responsibly and grounding our relationships with consumers in transparency and trust. And I promise you, I didn't pay her to write that based on this podcast. But, for me, I think they are, as I said right at the start, privacy is now being used as a differentiator. And it's weird, to do privacy right, you have to be transparent. It's a bit of an oxymoron, but you have to do it. You have to inform the individual around these areas. And I think we've shown that if you are transparent with an individual, that will build the trust, and that will give you a much better quality of data, because you can rely on it, because you know that that person has understood why they're giving up their data or why they're giving you a particular consent. And then you can use that and generate a lot more value. And that for me is really the biggest driver. And I think as we do move to a world where, as you saw that, what was it called? Generate on Dragon's Den, we are moving to a world where the individual is almost going to be the point of integration. The technology is there where, we're moving to a decentralized world where the individual will be in control of the data. Our phones hold pretty much all the data about us, and we need to have mechanisms where they are in control over who they are sharing that data to and the purposes, and that kind of goes right back to our original principles around My Life Digital.
It's brilliant. Yeah, it's because I think for us as an organisation at Databall, we hold the same sort of beliefs that you do, and it's something I know I and Daniel, we've spoken about it a lot before, is just that a lot of this stuff around data is, there's just almost no point unless you're being transparent, or the data that you have knows that you have it and knows what you're going to be doing with it, or the person stops seeing it as data, is what we always talk about. And yeah, it just completely comes back to the relationship that you want to build with your prospects and customers, doesn't it? And do you want it to be well informed? Do you want a lot of intent behind the user? Do you want them to appreciate your company? And that's how great brands are built as well, right? Because you can't build evangelists for your brand if you're hiding something, or if you're like prepared to accept like no intent behind them to contact them. It's just, whatever way you look at it, consent and the intent and the transparency behind it, for us is like the most important thing, and for you obviously 100% as well.
Yeah, and I think we're as I say, we're also pragmatists. We kind of come at this in the view that if you ask an individual, do you trust organizations with your data? We've just done a recent survey. 80% of them will say no. Yeah. If you ask an individual, the same individual, do you want personalized experiences from the brands you engage with? 80% of them will say yes. And the problem is you can't have one without the other.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, how do you enable that data to flow between those parties to enable those personalized relationships to take place? Because one of the other challenges today, and I know we're trying to wrap up, but one of the other challenges today is that we're starting to be dominated by AI as well. And AI is making decisions about us that or inferring on our behalf that are invariably wrong. Because everyone's now about AI, and trust me, there are not enough mathematicians or data scientists out there who can do it well enough to be able to infer what you really want to be doing at that moment in time. And therefore, again, that's going to come down to empowering individuals to provide you with more information so that you don't infer incorrectly about them, which can actually, from a brand point of view and reputational point of view, do you some massive harm. Because if you start inferring things about something that might negatively impact them, or offend them, then actually that's not good for the brand either. So I think my view has been be transparent, be open, ask the questions, but do it in a way that is a decent user experience, so that you can build and grow that relationship with the consumer over time.
Yeah, great point to end on. Thank you for that.
That's
cool.
That's very interesting. I think we always try and have a degree of objectivity on this show, and we try and approach things as objectively as we can. But when it comes to transparency, I think there's sort of, if you've listened to the show before, there's sort of no facade. I think, we definitely agree with you, and it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much, Jay.
Oh, you're welcome. Cheers, Jen. Cheers, Simon. Thank you.
Cheers, Jay. Thank you.
You're listening to the B2C Lead Generation podcast, and now it's time for the post-chat rundown. It's pretty simple. We talk through the conversation, assess what we've learned from our guest, and pull out the key ideas for you, the stuff we think can make a real difference to your lead gen.
That was J Cromack on the B2C Lead Gen podcast, and if you're searching for him, that's J, the letter J, online, not the name J. But yeah, that's really interesting. Simon, what did you think about that?
I thought it was a great guest, and the way I see it, and Jay is much more eloquent in saying it, is that there's effectively like transparent consent and potentially deceptive consent. And the difference between them is that obviously with transparent consent, there's the potential, or that you will have more intent in a user from a marketing perspective, whereas with deceptive consent, which is potentially hidden and the user is very well informed, is there any intent? And it's really the transparency that drives intent. That's what I think.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I think we talked about it a little bit, but when you think of consent, often it can be almost like a binary thing, like people have it or not, but actually it's an evolving thing. It's changing. There are degrees of it. It's like a whole spectrum. We covered the space, really interesting, and I think it's something to be aware of. But what I want to do, just to kind of put you on the spot, and I suppose I'm always the person who tries to bring it back to the people listening, what they need to know, what they can actually take from it, and sort of condense it. What do people listening need to know?
Basically, you need to be as transparent as fuck. It's the best way I can put it. And this is something I fundamentally believe as well, right? And like we fundamentally believe as an organization, that transparency is the thing that trumps absolutely everything. And that's transparency with the consumer or the prospect. How are you going to be contacting them, the level of consent that you get, how you get consent, how are you going to be using their data, how are you going to communicate with them? And ultimately, that consent drives the intent of the user, because if you're transparent with the consent, there is always going to be more intent behind them. So when we talk about intent, which we talk about a lot, ultimately it is driven by the user consenting to a transparent process where they know exactly what's going to happen. There is no surprises. So that's the key thing that I would take from it.
100%. I think that's a nice, eloquent way of putting it. But I think 100%. That's a good way of viewing it. And Jay also. It's nice to speak to people who fundamentally agree with us. That sounds bad, but who share this ideal is a better way of putting it. People who share these ideas and about how the industry should work. That was great.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, I think we keep coming back to this all the time. The data leads, however you're looking at it, prospects, is real people, and they have thoughts and emotions and wants and needs exactly like we all do. And it gets lost in the data because people view it as data. And by gathering consent correctly and being very transparent, you're treating them like a human. You're being human-centric, which is something that Jay touched on. And that's really at the core of marketing, and especially marketing with data, is that you've got to treat these people as humans and sort of communicate with them on their terms and on their basis. And that's something that all of us can learn from and think about how it sort of evolves our brands, how it feeds into our organizations, how we want to deal with the sort of wider world in terms of how we market and advertise ourselves.
Definitely. So that you're listening, that was the B2C Lead Generation podcast and why data transparency and consent unlocks growth.
Thanks for listening to the B2C Lead Generation podcast, the show for serious lead generators. Be sure to hit subscribe to hear more from those at the very cutting edge of the lead gen world.